I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous. A crisis without equal on Earth. The most profound collision of conscience, conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far. Where you see ideals, I see what is human, alas, all too human.
These are the words of the visionary German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. The crisis he is predicting was the crisis of religious faith that would sweep through Europe in the late 19th century. Nietzsche was the first thinker to realize that the death of God would give birth to something entirely new in human history. The idea of absolute freedom, of man as the sole measure of the universe. What he was describing was nothing less than the birth pangs of the modern world.
Nietzsche is as important as Marx, Freud and Einstein in the evolution of the way people think in the 20th century. The chief effect of Nietzsche on the 20th century has been a tremendous loosening up of moral certainties and intellectual certainties. People no longer know for sure what is good and evil, what is right and wrong.
God is dead, and God remains dead because we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? What was holiest and most powerful of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood from our hands?
Hitherto, the Church had been the arbiter of morals, the giver of moral truth. The idea that there isn't a fixed truth, the capital T, seems to us now quite commonplace in the 20th century, but Nietzsche was really a pioneer of this position. It seems to us very simple today because I think that we've more or less, all of us, taken it on board. The idea that we're not determined by some outside forces, that life is there for the making, that you make your choices, you develop yourself through your own effort.
I think of Nietzsche as the first great punk philosopher. I see him there in the Pantheon with a safety pin stuck through his nose and two fingers thrust up in the general direction of the philosophic Pantheon. And that is a positive aspect of him. As it were, paradoxically, in his most apparent nihilism, he seems to me also to be the most apparently positive of thinkers, because he's enjoining people to do it themselves in that way. His philosophy is not a guide that you should think like him, it's a guide that you should think for yourself.
Although Nietzsche was a great liberator, the kind of freedom he helped bring into being was also a terrible burden. He was all too aware that the death of God had left a void where certainties once existed. In order to fill it, he tried to do something which no one before him had ever attempted, and for which he would pay a heavy price.
He wanted to be the moralist of the new post-God society, so he was setting himself a task that he couldn't possibly fulfill. No one could fulfill that task. And without suggesting crudely or simplistically that he copped out by retreating into madness, I do think that some such escape was inevitable.
It's almost a subject for a play, is what went on in Nietzsche's mind those last fateful days before he was found in a state of dementia, whether or not those last few days reflected some hideous awakening or re-evaluation of all his own values.
Nietzsche's momentous philosophical journey ended at the age 44 in insanity. How far did the responsibility he took upon himself as a thinker in the end destroy him as a human being? On his passage into the unknown, Did he discover the ultimate truth about what it really means to be human, all too human?
By the time one has grown up, one remembers only the truly salient points concerning one's earliest childhood. The sequence of years flits past my gaze like a confused dream. Nevertheless, several things remain vivid and vital in my soul, and of these things, combined with what is obscure and gloomy, I shall paint my picture. I was born in Roken, near Lutzen, on October the 15th, 1844. I received in holy baptism the name Friedrich Wilhelm. My father was the preacher of this village, the perfect picture of a country parson, gifted in spirit and heart, adorned with all the virtues of a Christian. He lived a tranquil, simple, yet happy life.
In der Taufpredigt benutzte der Vater den Taufspruch: Was, meint ihr, will aus diesem Kindlein werden? Gutes oder Böses? Und im Anschluss beschrieb er also, was alles aus einem Kindlein werden kann. Welche Sünden und welche Versuchungen eigentlich auf so einen jungen Menschen zukommen können. Und er machte also diese radikale Dichotomie auf, des Guten und des Bösen. Nietzsche wird später einen Text schreiben, den er nennt Jenseits von Gut und Böse. Und Nietzsche hat zeitlebens versucht, diese radikalen Entgegensetzungen zu relativieren, sie aufeinander zu beziehen, sie voneinander abhängig zu machen.
Nietzsche's early childhood was probably the happiest time in his life. A baby sister was born when he was 2, and a brother followed a year later. But in 1847, catastrophe struck, when Nietzsche's father was diagnosed with a terminal brain disease.
Im Juli 1849 ist sein Vater gestorben und im Januar 1850 ist danach dann sein kleiner Bruder gestorben. Nietzsche hat seinen Vater immer als eine Art weltliche und geistige Autorität erlebt und musste nun zusehen, wie er über ein Jahr lang mit sehr großen Leidenszuständen zu ringen hatte. Und der Gott, für den sein Vater eigentlich da ist, dessen Diener er ist, straft diesen Vater mit so sehr viel Leiden. Das kann eventuell auch ausschlaggebend sein, dass also Nietzsche frühzeitig in der Naumburger Zeit schon am Christentum zweifelt.
Nietzsche was just 5 when he lost his father and brother. He moved with his mother and sister to the nearby town of Naumburg and was then sent to boarding school at Schulpforta 5 miles away, an establishment with a long tradition in religious education.
By the time we moved to Naumburg, my character began to show itself. I had already experienced considerable sadness and grief in my young life, and was therefore not as carefree and as wild as children usually are. My schoolmates were accustomed to teasing me on account of my seriousness. From childhood on, I sought solitude, and I felt best whenever I could give myself over to myself, undisturbed.
Well, this is his school leaving certificate, and it gives us more information than only his marks. It says that he is a diligent pupil, that he behaved well, and about his lessons in religious education, it says that he showed a lively interest in the teachings of Christianity, and he learned them very eagerly and easily.
In later life, Nietzsche would declare himself to be the Antichrist, but for now he betrayed no such sentiment. After leaving school, he went on to study theology at Bonn University, with a view to becoming a priest like his father before him. But on Easter Sunday, 1865, he refused to attend Holy Communion with his family at the local church in Naumburg. Later that year, he gave up his religious vocation altogether in order to study languages as a classical philologist. In a letter to his sister Elizabeth, he explained his reasons.
I write this to you, dear Elizabeth, only in order to counter the most usual proofs of believers. Every true faith is infallible. It performs what the believing person hopes to find in it, but it does not offer the least support for the establishing of an objective truth. Here, the ways of men divide. If you want to achieve peace of mind and happiness, have faith. If you want to be a disciple of truth, then search.
One often finds with Nietzsche that there is a crisis and a delayed reaction to it. This is very much the case with his abandonment of religion as well, so that the Antichrist, which is his most explicit statement against Christianity and against religion in general, comes over 20 years after he himself has abandoned the faith. He writes about his works as memorials to crises.
Nietzsche's most provocative attack on religion came in the parable of the madman, written late in his life, and which famously proclaimed the death of God.
Ich suche Gott, wo ist Gott?
Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God"? As many of those who do not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. "Why? Did he get lost?" said one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" said another. "Or is he hiding?" The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his glances. "Where is God?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers."
The madman is clearly offering some kind of warning that there's a tremendous cataclysm on its way. I think what's important for Nietzsche is that there's a number of events, let's call them intellectual events of the 19th century, which put together all work towards undermining the very foundations of Christian moral civilization. If you take Darwin as an example, I mean, Darwin was brought up in a very theological or religious context, and Nietzsche points out that before releasing or publishing his whole theory of natural selection, he had it for 20 years and he kept it in a cupboard stacked away. I think on Darwin's part he himself realised that it would have precisely the tremendous consequences, potentially nihilistic ones, that Nietzsche was detecting within the theory, that it would undermine the whole basis of Western morality and metaphysics, that it would show that the world functions and operates quite well or quite consistently without the need for any divine intervention.
In 1869, 10 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species, Nietzsche was appointed Professor of Classical Philology at Basel University. He had liberated himself from the confines of Christianity, but now he was searching for something to replace it with. Without divine sanction or retribution, human suffering was unintelligible. Nietzsche looked to philosophy for an answer, and discovered the teachings of the German atheist thinker Arthur Schopenhauer. Here he found the consolation he craved to make sense of a godless universe.
Once Nietzsche recognizes that the benevolent Christian God cannot be believed in any longer, it's natural that Schopenhauer's philosophy should appeal to him. Schopenhauer's philosophy is pessimistic at its very core. It recognizes that human experience is not, for the most part, very pleasant, and that there are certain ways in which we can accommodate ourselves with this truth, with what Nietzsche refers to in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, the truth of Silenus, that the best thing is not to have been born, but the second best thing is to die quickly.
There was, in Schopenhauer's view, one good way to get out of that misery, if only momentarily, and that was through art. Art had a very important role, and above all, music. So in the musical experience, you could transcend your earthly misery for a few moments.
For Nietzsche, nowhere was Schopenhauer's theory better illustrated than in the music of Richard Wagner. Nietzsche went to see his opera Tristan and Isolde 3 times. He identified with the suffering of the protagonists and found the ecstatic experience of the performance profoundly moving. Wagner became a surrogate father figure for Nietzsche, and he was a frequent visitor at the Wagner's house in Tribschen on Lake Lucerne during the 1870s. In the composer's art, Nietzsche saw the possibility for a renaissance in European culture based on the classical Greek model of tragedy. Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy, was largely inspired by Wagner and argued that Wagner's music represented a pre-Christian ideal, symbolized by the Greek god Dionysus.
The Dionysian culture was wildly energetic, wildly musical. It was associated for Nietzsche always with dance, just as it was historically. It was associated with inebriation, intoxication, excess, joy, and absolute imperviousness to sadness and pain, tragedy.
Nietzsche sought a philosophical answer to the pain of existence as he became increasingly debilitated by chronic physical ailments. Born with severe myopia, he had always been a sickly child. During the Franco-Prussian War, he contracted dysentery and diphtheria while serving as a medical orderly, and is generally believed to have been infected with brothel while a student. By the age of 30, Nietzsche had become a partial invalid.
Every 2 or 3 weeks, I spend about 36 hours in bed, in real torment. Perhaps I am gradually improving, but this winter is the worst there has been. I keep thinking it is such a strain getting through the day. The evening, there is no pleasure left in life, and I really am surprised at how difficult living is.
He refers to himself as being ill. He never refers to what he's ill with, ever. Now, this may just have been effect of the age. We're thinking of the 1880s, where it would be suicidal, I suppose, for some man to write in a book. He wouldn't get it published, perhaps, if he wrote in a book that he was suffering from syphilis. But he describes the symptoms so clearly that it's hard to believe that he didn't realise that his at least male readers of his books would know what he was describing. But it affected his life profoundly, inasmuch as he lived as an invalid for many, many days in each year. And so there were a great many things he couldn't do.
Nietzsche's illness was to become a major turning point in his life, both physically and philosophically. In 1876, at the opening of Wagner's great opera house at Bayreuth, Nietzsche left after the first act of The Ring, suffering from a mysterious illness. His relationship with Wagner was already under serious strain due to Nietzsche's objection to the composer's growing nationalism. Walking out on The Ring was the last straw.
At Bayreuth, Nietzsche felt literally nauseated, and that nausea was both a turning point and a symbol. I mean, it was clearly a physical symptom which was expressive of a psychological state. He couldn't stomach the spuriousness of the enthusiasm, the kind of reverence that Wagner was commanding and reveling in. It sickened him literally. He had to leave. The break with Wagner had become inevitable. You can't say, terribly sorry, Maestro, I wasn't feeling well. It was, Wagner was not someone who would forgive something like that.
His health really was deteriorating, and I think he needed a philosophy, his own philosophy, to cope with his life, to cope with his problems. And the Schopenhauer and Wagner way, the momentary way out in music, that wasn't enough for him anymore.
It was during the years of my lowest vitality that I ceased to be a pessimist. The instinct of self-restoration forbade me a philosophy of poverty and discouragement. This, in fact, is how that long period of sickness appears to me now. As it were, I discovered life anew, including myself. I turned my will to health, to life, into a philosophy, into the will to power.
He says somewhere that you yourselves are this will to power. And I think Nietzsche thought that ultimately the task was one of self-mastery, that is, of acquiring a certain kind of self-knowledge that would not be merely intellectual or abstract, because for Nietzsche all knowledge is ultimately rooted in the body. So for him, self-mastery involves acquiring as much knowledge as is possible about the human body, about your body, about its physiology, about its psychology.
He felt that one of the great influences of Christianity was to banish the body from culture. He suggested that perhaps the whole of Western philosophy has been a misunderstanding of the body. And his view was that our physical nature and our psychological nature has ultimate bearing on the way we think. And the phrase the will to power, die Wille zur Macht in German, I think can be read in terms of this idea of self-making. And what we might see as part of his legacy in the 20th century is the institutionalizing of self-making as therapy. And I think that that's a pioneering aspect of his work, and it leads on to Freud. I mean, arguably, without Nietzsche, there wouldn't be Freud.
Nietzsche's new philosophy resulted in the publication of Human, All Too Human, subtitled A Book for Free Spirits. Begun in the solitude of the Swiss countryside, it was as much a work of psychology as philosophy. It was Nietzsche's first great statement of individualism and challenged mankind to think for itself. He wrote it in short aphoristic bursts while out walking, a method of working he would continue for the rest of his life.
And so onwards, along a path of wisdom, with a hearty tread, a hearty confidence. However you may be your own source of experience. Throw off your discontent about your nature. Forgive yourself, your own self. You have it in your power to merge everything you have lived through, false starts, errors, delusions, passions, your loves and your hopes, into your goal, with nothing left over.
He had freed himself from the fetters of ancient traditions and of opinions which were not his. And free spirits to him means to be willing and to be able and to dare to have a fresh look out, to question one's own opinions all the time, and to be open-minded enough to find one's own way.
From Human All Too Human onwards, Nietzsche is effectively sending himself out into the wilderness. He's very aware that the book is a controversial one. He's very aware that by publishing it in 1878, he's going to cut himself off from a lot of the friends that he's had so far. Wagner himself saw the book as evidence already of Nietzsche's mental instability, and Nietzsche therefore found himself increasingly isolated. He's conceiving of himself as a sort of heroic wanderer figure heading out up mountains and into new territory.
A year after the publication of Human All Too Human, Nietzsche resigned his professorship at Basel due to ill health and moved to the Engadine region of the Swiss Alps. Living off a small pension, he found himself a room in this boarding house in the village of Sils Maria. For the next 10 years, he would spend the summers here, and the winters either on the French or Italian Riviera, moving as the climate changed to suit his health.
He loved the clean, well, rarefied air and the coolness in summer. This seemed to be his kind of climate. He felt that he could think clearer. He found what he was looking for in his prose, really, the kind of, he used the imagery, he was looking for something very hard and not susceptible to emotion, to human emotion. So what he found in the mountains was a picture of a world where human emotion was trivial.
Philosophy, as I have so far understood and lived it, means living voluntarily among ice and high mountains, seeking out everything strange and questionable in existence, everything so far placed under a ban by morality. The ice is near, the solitude tremendous, but how serenely all things lie in the light, how freely one breathes, how much one feels lies beneath oneself.
In 1882, while travelling in Italy, the old hermit of Sils Maria, as Nietzsche called himself, met the one and only romantic love of his life, Lou Andreas Salome, a brilliant young student. Though only 20 years old, Nietzsche described her as being as shrewd as an eagle and as brave as a lion, and considered her to be his philosophical protégé. They were introduced by his friend, the psychologist Paul Ray, and throughout the course of that year, the three of them were inseparable. They travelled round Italy together, living as free spirits.
He was trying to live out his philosophy with companions, and he, during that vacation year in Italy, he always discussed the idea of founding an almost religious philosophical community in an old monastery or something like that. It was a fantasy of his. I think he did not only see Lou as the ideal companion of that community of scholars, but he was very attracted to her as a woman.
He proposed marriage to Lou Salome, who didn't want to marry him or anybody, and suggested a ménage à trois with him and Ray. And then, a little while later, they had another meeting together in Leipzig, and then Ray and Lou Salome went off. And as time went on, Nietzsche realised that he'd been ditched. And he was in a fury of self-loathing, and his letters on this are quite, at this time, are quite convulsive. He says, I feel nothing but contempt on the part of everyone who meets me now. And clearly he had been thrown off of his rocker for a time.
This last morsel of life was the hardest I have yet had to chew, and it is still possible that I shall choke on it. I have suffered from the humiliating and tormenting memories of this summer as from a bout of madness. I am exerting every ounce of my self-mastery. Unless I discover the alchemical trick of turning this muck into gold, I am lost.
He wrote, if I am not able to turn all this muck to gold, I am finished. By muck he meant the state of mind and emotion that he was in. Well, he did, see, by writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra is a fictional character, but it borrows most of his characteristics from Nietzsche.
When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and went into the mountains. Here he enjoyed his spirit and his solitude, and for 10 years did not tire of it. But at last a change came over his heart, and one morning he rose with the dawn, stepped before the sun, and spoke to it thus. Behold, I am weary of my wisdom, like a bee that has gathered too much honey. I need hands outstretched to receive it.
Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the book is the work of an isolated man, and it's clear from the figure of Zarathustra in the book itself, who has such problems finding disciples. In the first book, he preaches to the townsfolk in the town that he descends to from his lonely mountain, and finds that they don't have ears to hear him. Zarathustra then is an isolated figure. He doesn't immediately find the right audience. The book is, in a sense, a quest for the right audience, and a quest on Zarathustra's part to realize what his task is.
When Zarathustra came into the next town, which lies on the edge of the forest, he found many people gathered together in the marketplace. And Zarathustra spoke thus to the people. Behold, I will teach you about the overman. Mankind itself is something that must be overcome.
Nietzsche proposes an ideal of self-overcoming, an ideal he calls the overman, not by having recourse to a metaphysical realm outside of the human, but within the possibilities of the human. It's a paradoxical notion, but it's one that Nietzsche is asking us to consider. How can we, as humans, transcend ourselves?
The idea of the overman came from Nietzsche's own battle for self-mastery. Human beings in general, he argued, had a duty to rise above the limitations of their own condition. But the original German term he created, Übermensch, can be interpreted in many ways. It is still often translated as Superman. This is a legacy of the Nazi era, when long after his death, Nietzsche was turned into a hero of the Third Reich. Nietzsche's Superman was able to be co-opted into fascist ideology because of the activities of his sister Elizabeth, who re-edited some of her brother's writings to promote the Aryan ideal.
Übermensch dürfen wir nicht verstehen als im Sinn, wie es die Nationalsozialisten missverstanden haben, die ja durch Nietzsches Schwester Nietzsche als ihren Ideologen eigentlich, geistigen Vater für ihre Rassentheorie als Grundlage angenommen haben. So ist Übermensch nicht zu verstehen. Übermensch heißt überwinden, einen neuen Weg suchen, nämlich auf den Weg ohne diese göttliche Figur, die mich hindert am Leben, sondern der Mensch, der in völliger Freiheit neue Wege sucht und in diesem Sinn gottlos ist.
If you translate Superman as the overman, which some people do, the Übermensch, The mountains were, in a sense, the overworld. They represented for Nietzsche a place of self-transcendence. And their opposite was the land down below, ordinary life, common life, that which had to be transcended.
I am a wanderer and a mountain climber, Zarathustra said to his heart. What returns, what finally comes home to me is my own self. Alas, I have begun my loneliest walk. But whoever is of my kind cannot escape such an hour. The hour which says to him, only now are you going your way to greatness. Peak and abyss, they are now joined together. For all things are baptized in a well of eternity and lie beyond good and evil.
In conceiving of a world beyond good and evil, beyond the fleeting preoccupations of the human condition, Nietzsche had transcended the muck, as he called it, of his own life experience and turned it into philosophical gold. But now, living virtually in total isolation in Sils Maria, he had all but sacrificed human contact for the world of his own imagination. Philosophy had become his consolation for a life of disappointment and deep-rooted loneliness.
My principal article of faith is that one can only flourish among people who share the identical ideas and the identical will. I have no one. That is my sickness. If, adopting a popular manner, I recommend Schopenhauer or Wagner to the Germans or conjure up Zarathustra's, these are my remedies. Above all else, they are hiding places where I can lose myself for a time.
But even for Nietzsche, such extremes of isolation eventually took their toll. In 1888, he moved down from the Alps to the Italian city of Turin, echoing Zarathustra's descent from his solitary mountain. Having, as he saw it, liberated humanity from its past, Nietzsche now set about redefining its future. He began formulating a new system of values for a society in which God was no more, a new morality beyond Christian virtues such as self-denial and pity. He called this project, which he hoped would be his crowning achievement, the transvaluation of all values.
What is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power in man, the will to power, power itself. What is bad? Everything that is born of weakness. What is more harmful than any vice? Active pity for all the failures and all the weak. That is Christianity. Christianity is the religion of pity. We are deprived of strength when we feel pity.
He had these great plans to transvalue all values. That was his project, and the books he wrote, The Antichrist and the Twilight of the Idols, were part of that project. But I do think he had a sense of time running out. I've found certain evidence that suggests to me he was aware of his growing incapacity, of the nature of his illness, and he had some thoughts about his own mortality.
This was a man who died young and spent most of his life dying. So it's entirely understandable that he would have been infused by pessimism and that he would have a tendency to weirdly align himself with the death of the culture that he was describing. The two became won for him in a bizarre way, and this is why you find him nodding out over the re-evaluation of all values, claiming to have written it in his last book, Esse, Homo, this projected title plan for a 5-volume work, and of course that was never achieved. There you have the pessimism of him never being able to come close to enacting what, after all, was a systematized destruction of systems. That's what he was aiming to do.
The transvaluation of all values. That is my formula for an act of supreme re-examination on the part of humanity. It is my fate that I have to be the first decent human being.
He saw it as his task to prescribe a morality for a civilization that had to live on without any divine sanctions. He was right, so far as he went, to question history, question logic, question all those assumptions that had been made. But when the point came to reconstitute something, the task turned out to be impossible for him. He had an absolutely marvelous mind, but that marvelous mind led him into a cul-de-sac, and if there is no way out, what do you do?
If you look at the letters he wrote in the beginning of January 89, I think it's quite obvious that he's mad. I mean, he signs these letters Dionysus, or the crucified one. He really thought of himself as a god taking upon him the suffering of all mankind, a sort of Christ figure. But I do think that reflects his theory that every man should be a god unto himself.
I think Nietzsche saw the challenge of being human in a very simple phrase. He spoke of the human condition as being zwischen Tier und Übermensch, that is, between the animal and the Superman. That is the challenge of the human condition. What you make out of your, as it were, endowment as an animal, how far you can go along the journey towards becoming a god. In January 1889, Nietzsche collapsed in the street in Turin, somehow overcome with sympathy at the sight of a horse that fell, overburdened or slipped on ice. But anyway, the horse fell, and Nietzsche went over and put his arms around the horse. And of course, Nietzsche has always been known as the philosopher against pity. But he was able to express, in one of his last gestures to the world, profound sympathy for the living condition that animals and human beings share.
Nietzsche's last sane action had been to affirm his identity not as a god, but as a man full of human weaknesses. Soon after his collapse in Turin, he was moved to an asylum and then back to his mother's house in Germany. Declared clinically insane, he passed his last years under his sister Elizabeth's care in this house in Weimar.
Elizabeth would let people come and have a look at her brother, at the philosopher, like an animal in a zoo, and who knows, being mentally in another world already. There has been intense speculation about the nature of his illness, that progressive paralysis could result from this syphilitic infection. But there are certain things about that diagnosis which don't fit in. For example, his living as more or less a vegetable for 11 years. That's an enormously long time for a person with that paralysis to go on living.
In 1900, Nietzsche died from a stroke. Over the next 30 years, Elizabeth took control of her brother's literary estate, including the unfinished Transvaluation of All Values. She re-edited sections of this, together with selections from his unpublished notes, into a collection entitled The Will to Power. It was through this book that she attempted to promote Nietzsche falsely as a Nazi thinker.
When he died, she turned this whole Villa Silberblick into a Nietzsche shrine for the Nietzsche cult, and the cult of his person and his philosophy. Many Nazi intellectuals liked to come here. Even the Führer Hitler came here once, and she saw to it that Nietzsche became something like the official philosopher of the Third Reich, which was ludicrous because he hated all kinds of nationalism. One could say Nietzsche was one of the first real Europeans.
It's immensely tricky discussing the question of the relationship between Nietzsche and German fascism. It's painful to contemplate how close he seemed to be with these statements, like saying, I'm dynamite and I'm, going to blow this whole situation up. It's so difficult not to see that as some genuine willing of this to happen in some way. But I don't think that's what it is. I think it is that at a philosophic level he grasped the idea that his philosophy represented, by its enactment, that break point where after this, après moi le déluge, and he did see that possibility could arise. It seems so ironic that Nietzsche should have been taken as a proto-fascist thinker at any point, because of course what he's most emphatically against is anything that denigrates the individual in that way.
He says, if you cannot live beyond or above the law, which he sees as the obligation of the philosopher, to question all values, which means you've got to live outside or beyond all laws. He says, if you cannot do that, if you find that task too great as a philosopher, then he says either you must construct another law or find refuge in madness. And it's interesting how we would interpret the meaning or significance of Nietzsche's descent into that black hole of madness. Did he ultimately find that burden, that responsibility, too great, and therefore collapsed under the very weight of the questions that he was posing for himself? I mean, maybe those questions are too great for any single individual to entertain or to think through.
The finest virtue of the great thinker is the magnanimity with which, as a man of knowledge, he intrepidly, often with some embarrassment, often with sublime mockery, offers himself and his life as the supreme sacrifice.